The year was 1970, and British comedy was about to undergo a transformation that no one could have predicted. The Monty Python team had descended upon the sleepy seaside town of Torquay to shoot their revolutionary sketch series, Flying Circus. They needed a place to stay, nothing fancy, just decent accommodation where they could rest between filming sessions. What they found instead at the Gleneagles Hotel was something far more valuable than a comfortable bed. The raw material for one of the greatest sitcoms in television history. The hotel manager, Donald Sinclair, was a man who seemed to have been put on this earth specifically to demonstrate how not to run a hospitality establishment. He treated his guests with open suspicion and contempt, as though every visitor was a potential criminal mastermind plotting against him. His behavior was so bizarre, so theatrically erratic that the Pythons found themselves in a state of stunned disbelief. One incident in particular left an indelible mark on John Cleese's memory. Eric Idle had briefly left his briefcase in the lobby while attending to some business. A normal hotel manager might have asked who it belonged to, or at least placed it behind the reception desk for safekeeping. Sinclair, however, operated on an entirely different wavelength. Convinced the briefcase was a bomb, he grabbed it without hesitation and hurled it over a garden wall. There was no investigation, no rational thought process, just pure, unfiltered paranoia translated into action. Nor was this an isolated incident. When Terry Gilliam committed the unforgivable sin of using his knife and fork in a manner that Sinclair deemed incorrect, the manager stormed over to correct his table manners, as though poor utensil etiquette were a criminal offense worthy of immediate intervention. Complaints from guests were met not with apologies or solutions, but with open contempt. Sinclair seemed to view every guest interaction as a battle to be won, a confrontation to be dominated, rather than a service to be provided. John Cleese was simultaneously baffled and amused. Here was a man so impossibly wrong for his chosen profession, so unintentionally ridiculous, that Cleese couldn't help but observe him with a comedian's analytical eye. There was something oddly brilliant in Sinclair's disaster class in hospitality management. He wasn't merely rude. He was a symphony of dysfunction, a masterclass in how to alienate customers and create an atmosphere of barely suppressed hostility. Most people would have left a bad review and moved on with their lives. But Cleese and his then-wife Connie Booth saw something else entirely: comedy gold. The idea of a short-fused hotel owner tangled in chaos refused to fade from their minds. They began taking notes, literal ones, documenting Sinclair's bizarre behavior and the surreal atmosphere of the Gleneagles Hotel. Years later, those notes would form the foundation of a television masterpiece. Long before the Monty Python madness and Basil Fawlty's hotel disasters, John Cleese was navigating the quiet seaside town of Weston-super-Mare as an only child. He was born John Marwood Cleese on October 27, 1939 in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, to Reginald Francis Cleese and Muriel Evelyn Cross. His father, an insurance salesman, had a peculiar dislike for the family's original surname, Cheese. Thinking it far too ridiculous for an army man, Reginald officially traded Cheese for Cleese in 1923, a decision that would later match the peculiar charm of his son's comic legacy. At school, Cleese towered over his classmates, quite literally. By the age of 13, he was already more than 6 feet tall, his gangly presence a source of attention before his wit ever was. But behind the awkward height and the school uniforms, something else was brewing. His early education at St. Peter's Preparatory School, paid for by a family inheritance, planted 2 essential seeds: a love for language and a sharp eye for human behavior. He wasn't just a clever boy excelling in cricket and boxing, he was already studying the absurdities of life, albeit unknowingly. The classroom, however, wasn't enough to contain his curiosity. A statue prank during his time at Clifton College hinted at the kind of humor Cleese would come to master: dry visual and oddly intellectual. He painted footprints leading away from a statue of Field Marshal Haig as if it had wandered off to the bathroom. Juvenile mischief perhaps, but even then it was storytelling through farce. Still, not all moments were humorous. When Cleese discovered at 17 that he had been passed over for a house prefect position despite his academic success, it left a mark. In his own words, it shifted his view of fairness and respect, something that would echo in the satirical lens through which he later examined authority figures and institutions. The sting of that rejection never fully faded, and it informed much of his later work, which frequently targeted the pretensions and failures of those in power. With university places under pressure due to the end of national service, Cleese had to delay his dream of attending Cambridge. Instead, he returned to his old prep school, not as a student, but as a teacher of Latin, science, English, and history. Ironically, the Latin lessons he once taught would find their way into Life of Brian, where Cleese's character famously corrects the grammar of anti-Roman graffiti. Every odd detour in his path somehow became part of his creative arsenal. Eventually, he claimed his spot at Downing College, Cambridge, to study law. But fate had other plans. At a student fair, the Footlights Theatre Club asked if he could sing or dance. No, Cleese said bluntly, adding that if there was anything worse than his dancing, it was his singing. "So, what do you do?" They asked. "I make people laugh." And that quite literally was his foot in the door. At Footlights, Cleese crossed paths with future collaborators Tim Brooke-Taylor, Bill Oddie, and the one who would change everything, Graham Chapman. Together, they began crafting the kind of strange, cerebral, and anarchic comedy that would go on to reshape British television. Even after graduating with a law degree in 1963, Cleese's father continued sending him newspaper ads for retail management jobs, just in case this comedy thing didn't work out. The Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay became the unlikely birthplace of one of Britain's most beloved comedic creations. Donald Sinclair, the real-life manager, seemed to operate according to a set of principles that stood in direct opposition to everything the hospitality industry stood for. He was suspicious, confrontational, and deeply, almost pathologically eccentric. Beyond the briefcase incident and the table manners correction, there were countless other moments that left the Pythons shaking their heads in disbelief. Sinclair would remove the wheels from guests' luggage for safekeeping, apparently believing that travelers might attempt to make a quick getaway without settling their bills. He would charge guests for using the hotel telephone at rates that seemed designed to discourage all forms of communication. He would hover over dining guests, correcting their posture and commenting on their food choices with undisguised contempt. The Pythons, however, were not merely victims of Sinclair's peculiar brand of hospitality. They were observers, students of human behavior, and they recognized that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. Cleese in particular began taking detailed mental notes, filing away Sinclair's mannerisms, his turns of phrase, his suspicious glances, and his explosive temper. Years later, with his co-writer and then-wife Connie Booth, Cleese would channel all of that madness into a character who would become a television legend. Basil Fawlty, the hilariously dysfunctional hotel manager at the center of Fawlty Towers, was born not from fiction, but from this bizarre reality. Cleese exaggerated the quirks, of course. Basil's tantrums, his endless passive-aggressive jabs, and his tragic inability to handle stress were turned up for comic effect. But the core of Basil, his suspicion, his social awkwardness, and his talent for offending everyone he met, came straight from Sinclair. The series itself ran for just 12 episodes between 1975 and 1979, but it left a mark few sitcoms ever achieve. Every chaotic misunderstanding, every meltdown behind the reception desk was a tribute to that bewildering experience in Torquay. Ironically, Sinclair never fully grasped that he had inspired the show. He passed away in 1981, apparently unaware that his misguided management style had been immortalized in British comedy. But while Fawlty Towers gained legendary status, the real story behind its origin remains stranger and funnier than fiction. It began with a chance encounter in a town no one expected to remember, inside a hotel no one expected to talk about, and a man who thought he was running a tight ship when in fact he was captaining the Titanic of customer service. If you ever wondered how a hotel run by a man on the brink of madness became one of the most beloved sitcoms in British history, it wasn't because John Cleese had a solo stroke of brilliance. Instead, it began with a marriage, not one built to last, but one that sparked creative magic. Cleese and his then-wife Connie Booth took a real-life experience so hilariously disastrous that it stuck with them for years and turned it into something unforgettable. The idea of a short-fused hotel owner tangled in chaos refused to fade. But rather than just make a show about a cranky innkeeper, the duo sharpened every moment with wit, confusion, and characters so outrageous they somehow felt real. The collaborative process between Cleese and Booth was remarkable. They would sit together for hours, hammering out dialogue, refining timing, and building the intricate farcical structures that would become the show's trademark. Booth, an American actress who had moved to England, brought a different perspective to the writing. Her character, Polly, the sensible, long-suffering waitress, often seemed to be the only adult in the building. Booth's American sensibilities helped temper Cleese's more outrageous instincts, creating a balance that made the show work. She understood that the comedy needed heart, that beneath all the shouting and the slapstick, there had to be something relatable, something human. When the show first aired on BBC in 1975, it didn't exactly charm the critics. One called it a disaster, confused by its fast-paced humor and absurd scenarios. But the public understood immediately. Audiences clicked with the manic energy of Basil Fawlty, Cleese's towering bundle of nerves and fury alongside the sharp-tongued Sybil, the ever-grounded Polly, and poor hapless Manuel, who turned every misunderstanding into an explosive mess. What made the show truly stand out wasn't just the slapstick chaos, but the intricate timing and farcical tension in every scene. Each episode was a powder keg of confusion, pride, and barely restrained hysteria. The jokes weren't just funny. They were structurally brilliant, building to crescendos of chaos that left audiences breathless with laughter. Behind the scenes, the story was less cheerful than the laughter suggested. By the time they began filming the second series in 1978, Cleese and Booth were already divorced. Still, they pressed on as creative partners, determined to finish what they started. It was the last time they would work together. But their final act was anything but bitter. Together, they closed the curtain on Fawlty Towers in style, their artistic chemistry unbroken even if their marriage wasn't. The cast they assembled was nothing short of perfection. Prunella Scales, who played the fearsome Sybil Fawlty, was a master of turning upper-middle-class sternness into comedic gold. In real life, she was nothing like her character, kind, thoughtful, and admired across the British acting world. She once shared that Sybil was inspired by women she'd observed who could command a room with just a raised eyebrow and a sharp voice. Her transformation into the commanding hotel co-owner was so complete that even Cleese admitted Sybil's shrill Basil was enough to put the fear of God into him on screen, at least. Andrew Sachs, whose portrayal of the ever-confused Manuel made him a household name, gave everything for his art. In one memorable scene, Basil hits Manuel with a frying pan. What most viewers didn't know was that the first take used a real pan, leaving Sachs with a nasty bruise. After that, they switched to a rubber one, but the damage was done, both literally and symbolically. Sachs also suffered minor burns during a fire scene gone wrong. Yet he never once complained. With a smile and a shrug, he returned to the set again and again, turning Manuel into one of the most beloved and physically abused characters in sitcom history. Ballard Berkeley, who played the Dottie Major Gowan, brought an eccentric charm to the series. His portrayal of the ex-military man, full of outdated views and unexpected zingers, wouldn't pass today's filters, but that was precisely what made the character so memorable. Berkeley's performance was a masterclass in creating a character who was simultaneously ridiculous and oddly endearing. Brian Hall brought flair and a bit of kitchen anarchy as Terry the chef, though he appeared in fewer episodes. After Fawlty Towers, he kept working in television and film until his passing in 1997. Similarly, Jill Flower and Renee Roberts, the elderly pair Miss Tibbs and Miss Gatsby, proved how even smaller roles can steal hearts. Their quirky affection for Basil added a layer of charm to the already chaotic hotel. The chemistry among the cast remained electric, proof that sometimes the best comedy comes from those willing to laugh through the pain. That strange mixture of tension and teamwork created something timeless. As new generations discover Fawlty Towers, they're greeted not just by brilliant writing and unforgettable performances, but by the quiet, often unseen sacrifices that made it all possible. It's easy to get caught up in the laughter and forget the cost. But perhaps that's part of the show's genius. Beneath the shouting, the pratfalls, and the burned breakfasts was a cast that showed up, gave their all, and left behind a legacy that still stands strong. Rubber frying pans and all, the set might have been filled with awkward silences, ice packs, and private heartaches, but when the cameras rolled, the magic returned. The show's intricate timing demanded absolute precision, and the cast delivered episode after episode. Every pratfall, every slammed door, every perfectly timed pause was the result of countless hours of rehearsal and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Cleese's perfectionism was legendary. He would demand take after take until every gesture, every glance, every word was exactly right. His co-stars sometimes found this exhausting, but they also recognized that his commitment to excellence was what made the show so brilliant. Scales once recalled that Cleese would obsess over the smallest details, insisting on dozens of takes for a single scene until the timing was flawless. That attention to detail paid off. Even now, decades later, the show's humor feels fresh. It's quoted, studied, and still watched by new generations who can't help but laugh at Basil's escalating fury or Manuel's innocent confusion. Fawlty Towers proved that chaos, especially the kind born from two people trying to turn disaster into comedy, can be timeless. Ironically, for something so beloved, the BBC nearly pulled the plug after just 6 episodes. The initial ratings were decent, but not spectacular, and some executives weren't convinced the show had mainstream appeal. It wasn't until reruns began attracting larger and more devoted audiences that the network gave the green light for a second and final series in 1979. Only 12 episodes were ever made, yet those dozen entries sealed the show's place in television history. Over time, the critics reversed course. What was once seen as a misfire became a gold standard. In 2000, the British Film Institute named it the greatest British TV series of all time. Today, nearly half a century later, Fawlty Towers remains one of the most quoted, adored, and referenced sitcoms in history. And though it was built on miscommunication, mishaps, and mounting tension, its legacy is clear. Some disasters are too good to clean up. But what made one episode out of just 12 explode into infamy? And why does it still spark debate decades later? The answer lies in an episode that pushed the boundaries of comedy so far that it almost tore the show apart. Even at the height of its success, laughter didn't shield Fawlty Towers from controversy. And one particular episode pushed the line between comedy and offense, so far it almost tore the show apart. It was called The Germans, and from the very start it was chaos wrapped in satire. Viewers first saw Basil Fawlty, played with perfect absurdity by John Cleese, stumbling through his hotel duties after suffering a nasty blow to the head. Now, Basil was already a disaster waiting to happen on a normal day, but with a concussion, what followed was a tornado of missteps, awkward encounters, and one of the most infamous punchlines in British television history. The trouble began when a group of German tourists checked into the hotel. Basil, barely coherent and desperate not to offend them, issued a firm command to his staff, "Don't mention the war." But true to his character, within moments he was doing exactly that and far worse. In his rambling attempt to play host, Basil spiraled into a surreal, fast-talking tirade full of Second World War references, Nazi comparisons, and then, as if things couldn't get more uncomfortable, a full goose-step march through the lobby with an over-the-top imitation of Adolf Hitler. Oblivious to the offense he was causing, he told Polly, "Don't mention the war. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it all right." He referred to the guest's food order as orders which must be obeyed at all times without question, and repeated their meal request as a prawn gobles, a Hermann Goering, and 4 Colditz salads. When a German guest asked him to stop talking about the war, Basil replied, "Me, you started it." When the guest protested, "We did not start it," Basil shot back, "Yes, you did, you invaded Poland." It was outrageous. It was completely over the top. And for some, it was just too much. British viewers were divided. Many couldn't stop laughing, recognizing that the real target of the joke wasn't the Germans at all, it was Basil himself. His ignorance, his arrogance, and his total lack of self-awareness were always at the heart of the show's humor. In this case, the war jokes weren't glorifying anything. They were making Basil look like a fool. That was the point. But others, including BBC executives, didn't see it that way. Letters flooded in. Critics accused the show of making light of a dark and painful history. Some called it tasteless. A few even demanded the episode be pulled permanently. And while the BBC didn't ban it outright, the backlash was serious enough that network officials considered shelving the episode for good. The timing of the episode's first broadcast was particularly sensitive. It aired in 1975, just 30 years after the end of World War II. Many British viewers still had vivid memories of the war, and many had lost family members in the conflict. The war was not ancient history, it was living memory, and some found the treatment of such a painful subject in a sitcom deeply inappropriate. In the end, the BBC let the episode stay, but only after a long and heated internal debate. Some executives argued that the satire was sophisticated enough to withstand scrutiny, while others maintained that the subject matter was simply too sensitive to treat with humor. The debate was passionate and deeply divided, reflecting the broader cultural ambivalence about how to treat the legacy of World War II in popular culture. Across the channel, the response in Germany was a bit more complex. Some German viewers understood the satire and appreciated the way the episode poked fun at British attitudes rather than at them. They laughed at Basil's foolishness and saw the ridiculousness for what it was. For these viewers, Basil wasn't mocking Germans. He was exposing the absurdity of British obsessions with the war, and they could appreciate the humor in that. But others didn't find it funny at all. For those with family members who had lived through the war, or worse, died in it, the slapstick portrayal of Hitler and the awkward war jokes felt insensitive and painful. The wounds of World War II were still raw in Germany, and the episode's treatment of the subject matter struck some as callous and disrespectful. As if the war references weren't enough, the Germans contained another layer of offensive material that would prove equally controversial. The character Major Goen, played by Ballard Berkeley, used highly offensive racial slurs while regaling Basil with a story about taking a woman to see a test match featuring India. The Major was portrayed as an old-fashioned, doddering ex-military man whose views were clearly meant to be ridiculed rather than endorsed. Basil himself even calls out the Major's language in the episode, making it unmistakably clear that these were not views the show supported. Yet, this subtlety was lost on many modern viewers and executives. In 2013, the BBC edited the Major's use of racial slurs from a repeat transmission of the episode, prompting criticism from some viewers. The BBC defended its decision, stating, "We are very proud of Fawlty Towers and its contribution to British television comedy. But public attitudes have changed significantly since it was made, and it was decided to make some minor changes with the consent of John Cleese's management to allow the episode to transmit to a family audience at 7:30 p.m. on BBC Two. The decision to edit the episode rather than simply broadcast it with a warning sparked a fierce debate about censorship and creative integrity. Some argued that the BBC was right to remove language that would offend modern audiences, while others maintained that the edits were a form of historical revisionism that undermined the integrity of the original work. But the controversy didn't end there. In June 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd protests and the global Black Lives Matter movement, UKTV, a BBC-owned streaming platform, temporarily removed the Germans from its service due to concerns over racial slurs. The move sparked immediate outrage, particularly from John Cleese himself. The removal came amid a wave of reappraisals of classic television. HBO Max withdrew Gone with the Wind for its racial depictions, while Little Britain, Come Fly With Me, and The League of Gentlemen were pulled from streaming platforms in the UK. The cultural reckoning following George Floyd's murder had prompted a widespread examination of media content, and many platforms were scrambling to remove material that might be deemed offensive. UKTV's decision to remove the Germans was particularly controversial because the episode had already been edited to remove the most offensive language. The platform had included the episode in a lineup of classic British comedies, but after the protests, executives determined that the episode's content was too problematic to broadcast. Cleese, never one to back down from a fight, passionately defended the episode. Writing online, he blasted the decision as stupid and branded BBC management cowardly and gutless. He argued that the point of the script had always been satire. Basil Fawlty was a figure of ridicule, not someone the audience was meant to admire. He explained to an Australian newspaper the Major was an old fossil left over from decades before. We were not supporting his views, we were making fun of them. If they can't see that, if people are too stupid to see that, what can one say? Fawlty Towers has given a large number of people a great deal of happiness. Why would you want to stop that? It reminds me of the definition of a Scottish Presbyterian as someone who has a nasty, sneaking feeling that someone, somewhere, is having a good time. Cleese's anger was directed squarely at the BBC. It used to have a sprinkling of people who had actually made programs, he wrote, accusing today's management of caring more about protecting their jobs than defending creative freedom. That's why they're so cowardly and contemptible. Cleese pointed out that British comedy had long used offensive characters as a way of exposing prejudice. He cited Alf Garnett, the bigoted patriarch of Till Death Us Do Part, whose reactionary views were made laughable by their sheer absurdity. We laughed at Alf's views, and in laughing we discredited them, Cleese explained. That's how satire works. Cleese had a point. British comedy has a long and distinguished tradition of using bigoted characters to expose the absurdity of prejudice. From Alf Garnett to Basil Fawlty, these characters serve as cautionary examples, their prejudices held up to the light and shown to be ridiculous. The laugh is always at the bigot's expense, never at the expense of the groups they target. I would have hoped that someone at the BBC would understand that there are two ways of making fun of human behavior, Cleese wrote on Twitter. One is to attack it directly. The other is to have somebody who is patently a figure of fun speak up on behalf of that behavior. One of the most remarkable aspects of the entire controversy is the response from Germany itself. Across the channel, reaction was more complex than many expected. Some German viewers understood the satire and appreciated the way the episode poked fun at British attitudes rather than at them. They laughed at Basil's foolishness and saw the ridiculousness for what it was. In April 2024, the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger, gave his official endorsement to the controversial episode. A spokesman for the ambassador told the Mail on Sunday, "We here at the embassy think the iconic restaurant scene is funny. To quote Basil Fawlty, we think it's really good." Cleese himself has always found the German public appreciative of his work. He told the Mail on Sunday, "The only people who have never ever complained about the German episode are the Germans. No German has ever complained to me about that because they are what I call grown-ups. They can take a joke." This endorsement from Germany adds another layer to the debate. If the very people supposedly being mocked in the episode find it funny and recognize it as satire, then who exactly is being protected by removing it from streaming platforms? The answer, it seems, is a modern sensibility that often mistakes the depiction of prejudice for an endorsement of it. The German public's appreciation for the episode suggests that they understand something that many of the episode's critics in the UK and the US do not. That the joke is on Basil, not on them. Basil's obsession with the war is portrayed as ridiculous, his attempts to avoid mentioning it failing spectacularly because he is, at his core, a man who cannot help but expose his own ignorance and prejudice. Following the public outcry, UKTV quickly reversed its decision. On June 13, 2020, The platform announced it would be reinstating the episode in the coming days once extra guidance had been added to the beginning of the program. The platform stated, "We will be adding extra guidance and warnings to the front of programs to highlight potentially offensive content and language. We will reinstate Fawlty Towers once that extra guidance has been added." The episode remains available on BritBox and Netflix, both of which carry warnings about outdated language and discriminatory content. In 2021, the BBC broadcast the episode on BBC One after EastEnders, airing the infamous Nazi scene in full, but editing out the Major's racial slurs. The decision divided fans online, with some slamming the BBC for airing any of the shocking episode, while others slammed the woke broadcaster for the edits. The question of warnings versus edits remains a contentious one. Some argue that warnings are sufficient, allowing viewers to make informed choices about what they watch. Others maintain that editing is necessary to protect viewers from potentially harmful content. Still, others argue that any form of censorship, whether editing or warning labels, is an affront to creative integrity. The removal of the Germans must be understood within the broader context of cultural reappraisal that has taken place in the 21st century. As society has become more sensitive to issues of race, gender, and historical trauma, many classic works of popular culture have come under scrutiny. Television comedies from the 1970s and 1980s often contain content that would be considered deeply offensive by today's standards. Racial slurs, sexist jokes, and homophobic humor were common in mainstream entertainment. While the intent behind such humor was sometimes satirical, the effect was often to normalize prejudice and marginalize already vulnerable groups. The question facing streaming platforms and broadcasters is how to handle this content. Should they leave it unedited, providing historical context and warnings? Should they remove it entirely? Or should they edit it, removing the most offensive elements while preserving the overall structure of the work? There is no easy answer, and different platforms have adopted different approaches. The controversy over the Germans reflects a broader tension between artistic integrity and social responsibility. On one hand, there is a compelling argument that works of art should be preserved in their original form, that to edit them is to erase history and undermine the artist's vision. On the other hand, there is a genuine concern about the harm that offensive content can cause, particularly to members of marginalized communities. Cleese's defense of the episode rests on a sophisticated understanding of how satire works. He has consistently argued that comedy can be an effective tool for exposing and challenging prejudice, that by making bigots look ridiculous, satire can help to discredit their views. This is not a new argument. The satirist has always walked a fine line, using ridicule and exaggeration to expose the flaws in individuals and institutions. The satirist's targets are not the victims of prejudice, but the perpetrators, and the satirist's goal is not to harm, but to heal, to use laughter as a tool for social improvement. William Thrall, a critical theorist, observed that satire blends a critical attitude with humor and wit to the end that human institutions or humanity may be improved. The true satirist is conscious of the frailty of institutions of man's devising and attempts through laughter not so much to tear them down as to inspire remodeling. In that sense, the Germans achieve precisely what great satire should. It held up a mirror to British obsessions and prejudices, exposing them through laughter. Basil Fawlty's frantic attempts to avoid mentioning the war reveal a culture still obsessed with a conflict that ended decades earlier. His ignorance and prejudice are the target of the joke, not the Germans he is trying not to offend. However, satire does not always land as intended. For satire to be effective, the audience must understand the satirist's intent. They must recognize that the bigot is being mocked, not endorsed. When this understanding is lacking, the satire can misfire, causing harm rather than promoting understanding. This is particularly true when the targets of the satire are groups that have historically been marginalized or oppressed. A joke about a bigot may be intended to expose and discredit prejudice, but if the audience hears only the prejudice and not the criticism, the effect can be to reinforce harmful stereotypes. This is why many critics of the Germans argue that the episode is problematic despite Cleese's intentions. The Major's use of racial slurs may be intended to expose his bigotry, but the slurs themselves are still heard by audiences, and they can still cause harm. The Nazi references, even when intended to mock Basil's ignorance, can still be painful to viewers with personal connections to the Holocaust. The challenge for modern audiences is to approach such works with a nuanced understanding of their historical context and their satirical intent. This requires education and guidance, which is why many platforms have chosen to add warnings to such content rather than remove it entirely. Despite the ongoing controversy, The Germans has secured its place in pop culture history. Basil's frantic cry of "Don't mention the war" is etched into British popular culture, parroted, quoted, and debated for generations. The episode remains one of the most memorable of the series, a testament to the power of bold, provocative comedy. The phrase "don't mention the war" has become shorthand for any situation in which someone is trying to avoid an awkward topic, particularly one that touches on national identity or historical trauma. It is a testament to the episode's cultural impact that a single line from a sitcom broadcast in 1975 can still resonate so powerfully in the 21st century. The episode has been referenced in countless other works, from political cartoons to comedy sketches to advertising campaigns. It has become part of the cultural vocabulary, a shared reference point that transcends the boundaries of the sitcom that gave it birth. The conversation around the Germans hasn't faded. If anything, it's become a case study in how comedy evolves and how the same scene can be viewed in two completely different ways depending on who's watching and when. As society continues to grapple with issues of representation, sensitivity, and historical trauma, the episode serves as a touchstone for debates about the limits of humor. Some argue that The Germans is a masterpiece of satire, a brilliant takedown of British obsessions and prejudices that remains relevant decades after its first broadcast. Others maintain that it is an uncomfortable relic of a less sensitive era, a reminder of how television once routinely normalized offensive content. Still, others occupy a middle ground, recognizing both the episode's satirical intent and its potential to cause harm. This ongoing debate reflects a broader cultural conversation about the role of comedy in society. Should comedy push boundaries, challenging audiences to confront uncomfortable truths? Or should it be more careful, mindful of the harm that offensive content can cause? There's no easy answer, and the debate is likely to continue for years to come. Cleese's defense of the episode rests on the argument that comedy can be a force for good, exposing prejudice and promoting understanding. He has consistently maintained that the real target of the Germans is not the German people, but Basil Fawlty himself, a man whose ignorance and arrogance are held up to ridicule. This interpretation is supported by a careful reading of the episode. Basil's attempts to avoid mentioning the war are doomed to fail, because he is, at his core, incapable of controlling his own prejudices. His brain injury serves as a device to lower his inhibitions, revealing the bigotry that lurks beneath his carefully constructed facade of refinement. The episode's humor is not cruel but corrective. We laugh not at the Germans, but at Basil, whose ignorance is laid bare for all to see. The Nazi references are not glorified but mocked, their absurdity exposed through Basil's clumsy attempts to incorporate them into polite conversation. As William Thrall observed, the true satirist attempts through laughter not so much to tear them down as to inspire remodeling. The Germans is a classic example of satire in this tradition, using humor to expose and discredit prejudice while inviting audiences to reflect on their own attitudes. However, even the most well-intentioned satire can cause offense. The line between exposing prejudice and reinforcing it can be thin, and the satirist must tread carefully. When the subject matter is as painful as the Holocaust and as sensitive as racial prejudice, the risks are particularly high. For viewers with personal connections to the Holocaust, the episode's depiction of Hitler and its casual references to Nazi atrocities can be deeply painful. For members of racial minorities who have been subjected to slurs, the Major's use of offensive language can be triggering even when presented in a satirical context. This is not to say that such content should be banned or censored, but it does suggest that it should be presented with care, with appropriate context and warnings that allow viewers to make informed choices about what they watch. What, then, can we learn from the controversy over the Germans? Perhaps the most important lesson is that comedy does not exist in a vacuum. The same joke can be funny to one person and offensive to another, and the context in which it is delivered matters enormously. The satirist's intent is important, but it is not everything. A joke that is intended to expose prejudice can still cause harm, and creators must be mindful of this. At the same time, audiences must be willing to engage with satire critically, recognizing the difference between the endorsement of prejudice and its exposure. The controversy over the Germans also highlights the importance of historical context. When the episode was first broadcast in 1975, World War II was still a living memory for many viewers. Today, it is history, and the emotional resonance of the subject matter has changed accordingly. This does not mean that the episode is no longer offensive. For many viewers, the pain of the Holocaust and the trauma of racial prejudice remain real and immediate. But it does suggest that the episode's meaning may have shifted over time, and that different generations may interpret it differently. Despite the ongoing controversy, John Cleese has remained defiant. In 2024, at the age of 84, he announced an ambitious reboot of Fawlty Towers, co-writing it with his real-life daughter, Camilla Cleese. The revival promises to bring Basil's grumpy genius into the modern age, though not everyone is convinced it's a good idea. The stage adaptation of Fawlty Towers, based on 3 episodes, including the Germans, opened at the Apollo Theatre in London in May 2024. The adaptation was a success, suggesting that audiences remain hungry for the show's particular brand of chaotic, farcical humor. But can a show so deeply rooted